The autumn wind howled through the Montana plains like a wounded coyote, sharp and cold enough to sting the skin. It carried with it the promise of another hard winter, a reminder that the frontier spared no one for long. Abigail Thornfield stood on her porch, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, watching the last of the sun bleed red behind the mountains. Months had passed since Samuel's burial. 6 months of fixing fences, mending saddles, and sleeping alone in Acabin that suddenly felt too big. The other ranchers had come around in those first few weeks, offering help, dropping off food, whispering their sympathy. But sympathy fades quicker than daylight in the West. By autumn, the visits had stopped. Folks had their own troubles, and a widow running a ranch alone was Astri everyone knew the ending to. Abigail looked out across the fields. The land stretched endless and empty, the way it always had. It had taken her husband's life piece by piece, and now it seemed to be waiting for hers. She was turning to go inside when she saw movement on the horizon. 2 riders, dark shapes against the fading sky. Her pulse quickened. Travelers didn't come this far out without reason, and night was close. She reached for the Winchester, leaning against the door frame. The riders drew closer. A tall man in a long, dust-covered coat, and behind him a smaller figure clinging to his back. When they reached the gate, the man dismounted, slow and deliberate, like someone who'd been in the saddle far too long. "Ma'am," he called, tipping his hat. "Sorry to trouble you this late. Name's Nathaniel Blackwood. I was told in town you might be needing a ranch hand." Abigail kept her grip near the rifle. "Who told you that?" "Fellow at the general store said the widow Thornfield was trying to hold her place alone. Said you were too proud to ask for help but might not turn it away if it came knocking." That sounded exactly like Henry from town. Meddlesome, nosy, and usually right. Abigail's lips twitched despite herself. "And you just happened to be looking for work?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. My daughter and I have been riding near 3 weeks. We're looking for a place to winter. I can mend, ride, handle cattle, and I don't drink nor gamble. You'll get honest work for fair wages." Before she could answer, the smaller figure slid down from the horse. A little girl, no more than 7 or 8, stood there holding a ragged cloth doll against her chest. Her cheeks were windburned, her eyes too big for her thin face. "Papa," she whispered, tugging at his coat. "I'm cold." Abigail felt something twist deep in her chest. She thought of the empty rooms in her house, the silence that filled it, and the way she sometimes caught herself setting 2 plates before remembering she no longer needed to. "What's her name?" she asked quietly. "Evangeline," the man said, "but she answers to Evie." Abigail studied them both. The man's clothes were worn but mended, his boots cracked at the seams. The girl's dress had been let down at least twice. They looked like people who'd seen hard times but hadn't given up. She sighed, lowering the rifle. "You can put your horses in the barn. There's hay in the loft. When you're done, come inside. I've got stew on the stove, and it's too much for one person anyway." Nathaniel's relief flickered across his face before he masked it. "We're obliged, ma'am. Truly." As they led their horses away, Abigail watched the little girl's small hand clutch her father's coat. The wind rattled through the dry grass, and for the first time in months, the sound didn't make her feel so alone. Inside, she stirred the stew and added another log to the fire. She found herself setting 3 bowls instead of 1, her movements uncertain but natural, as if her hands remembered something her hearth hadn't dared to. The knock came sooner than she expected. Nathaniel stood there, hat in hand, his daughter beside him, both freshly washed at the pump. "Comin'," Abigail said, stepping aside. The child's eyes went wide as she took in the room, the firelight, the quilts on the walls, the shelves of Samuel's old books. "It's pretty," she whispered. Abigail smiled gently. "Thank you. Would you like to help me set the table?" Evie nodded eagerly and followed her to the cupboard. Her small hands trembled slightly as she carried the bowls to Thedible, careful not to drop them. Over supper, the cabin filled with sounds that had been missing for too long. Voices, laughter, the scrape of spoons against bowls. Nathaniel ate like a man used to hunger, slow and grateful. Evie barely finished half her portion before her head began to nod. "How long since her mother passed?" Abigail asked softly. 4 months, he said, his voice rough. "Fever took her. We had a small spread in Wyoming. Stayed as long as we could, but sometimes staying hurts worse than leaving." Abigail understood that all towel. "You've been traveling since working, but most folks don't want a man with a child in tow. Can't blame them." His gaze fell on Evie, already asleep in her chair. Couldn't leave her behind. Abigail reached out and smoothed the little girl's hair without thinking. "There's a small room off the kitchen. Used to be for storage, but it'll do for 2 bedrolls if you want to stay. Nathaniel looked up sharply. You're offering us the job. Quote, I'm offering you a trial. She said, 2 weeks, $30 a month plus board. You'll earn every cent of it. He extended his hand. You'll have no regrets, ma'am. You have my word. They shook on it the frontier way. No papers, no witnesses, just trust. Abigail lifted Evie carefully and carried her to the small room. The child stirred but didn't wake, her arms wrapping around Abigail's neck in sleepy instinct. That simple trust hit Abigail harder than she expected. When she came back, Nathaniel stood by the fire, his face tired but peaceful. Thank you, he said. Save it, she replied softly. You'll earn it come morning. He nodded. How long's it been for you? 6 months, she said quietly. Gets easier, he told her. Not easy, just easier. They stood together in the warm glow of the fire, 2 souls carved hollow by loss, sharing the smallest flicker of comfort. Outside, the wind moaned across the plains. But inside, for the first time in a long time, the house felt alive again. Tomorrow would bring work and questions and maybe trouble. But tonight, the widow wasn't alone. And neither was he. The smell of frying bacon drifted through the cabin before dawn, mixing with the sharp scent of coffee. Nathaniel stirred awake, disoriented for a moment, until he saw his daughter curled beside him, breathing soft and even. It took him a second to remember where he was, safe, warm, and for the first time in months under a real roof. When he stepped into the main room, Abigail was already at the stove, her sleeves rolled up, hair pinned neatly in a bun. The light from the lantern caught the strands of gold in her hair as she worked. Morning, she said without turning. Coffee's ready. Breakfast will be up in a few minutes. He poured himself a cup, savoring the warmth. Can start on chores as soon as I'm done. Eat first, she said. Plenty of time to work after. When Evangeline appeared, rubbing sleep from her eyes, Abigail smiled. Good morning, sweetheart. Want some milk with your breakfast? The child's eyes widened. Real milk. Fresh from the cow this morning. Evie looked to her father for permission. At his nod, she whispered, Yes, please, ma'am. They ate together. 3 people who by chance or fate had found one another in the wide emptiness of Montana. Abigail couldn't help but notice how the little girl tucked half her biscuit into her pocket. There's plenty more, she said gently. You don't need to save it. Evie ducked her head. Mama said never waste food. Abigail smiled softly. Your mama was a wise woman. But around here you eat until you're full. That's a rule. After breakfast, Nathaniel went to mend the coral fence while Abigail took Evangeline to gather eggs. The morning light was crisp, the sky high and blue. From where he worked, Nathaniel could see them near the henhouse. The widow patient and steady, the child's laughter bright and unguarded. It had been a long time since he'd heard that sound. By midday, the corral fences stood solid again. Nathaniel wiped sweat from his brow, looking toward the house. Evie ran across the yard, clutching an egg in each hand, her smile wide enough to reach the heavens. Abigail followed, skirts brushing the grass, laughing at the child's excitement. Papa Evie called 12 eggs, and Mrs. Abigail said, I can see the kittens in the barn. Kittens, huh? Nathaniel chuckled. Sounds like you've had quite a day. Abigail met his eyes, her laughter fading to something softer. She's a good child, she said, and she adores you. She's all I've got left, he said quietly. Everything I do for her. That evening, the smell of fresh bread filled the cabin. Abigail had let Evie help knead the dough. Flour dusted the table, their hands, even Abigail's cheek. Nathaniel leaned against the doorway, watching them. It was a simple scene, yet something about it made Hishist ache. You ever baked before? Abigail teased, glancing at him. Not since my wife, he said, voice low. She loved making bread. Said it made the house feel alive. Abigail smiled faintly. Then she was right. They ate the bread warm with honey, and for a little while the world outside, the loneliness, the danger, the hard winters felt far away. When supper was over, Evie begged for a story. Abigail hesitated, then began one her grandmother had told her as a girl about a frontier woman who chased off a bear with nothing but a rolling pin. The child giggled, eyes wide, completely enraptured. Nathaniel watched them from his chair, the firelight flickering across both their faces. It felt strange, this peace, this warmth, but good, needed. By the time the story ended, Evie was nodding off against her father's arm. Abigail took her gently, carried her tobed, and returned a few minutes later, smoothing her skirt. She's sleeping, she said softly. Thank you, Nathaniel murmured. For all of this? Abigail shook her head. Don't thank me. You've done more work in a day than most men do in a week. She hesitated, then added, It's been nice having company again. Feels like a real home, Nathaniel said, then caught himself. She gave Esmol a sad smile. It hasn't felt like that in a long time. Outside, the wind picked up. Coyotes cried in the distance. Nathaniel stood and checked the window latches out of habit. Abigail watched him, noticing the way he moved. Quiet, deliberate, like a man used to danger. You handle yourself like someone who's seen more than cattle work, she said. He paused, then gave a half smile. Old habits die hard. Used to wear a badge. Deputy Marshal back in Kansas. Abigail blinked, surprised. All man was, he said simply. Quit after my wife died. Took the girl and left. Some things you can't keep doing once the light goes out. Her voice softened. I'm sorry. He nodded, staring into the fire. You lose someone, you think the world ends. But it don't. It just gets quiet. Real quiet. Abigail understood more than she could say. She moved closer, the fire light warming her face. You're right. It gets quiet until someone knocks on your door and reminds you you're still alive. They stood there in silence, the flames crackling between them, both feeling that strange pull neither had expected. Tomorrow, she said, breaking the stillness, we bring the herd down from summer pasture. Winter's coming fast, he smiled faintly. I'll be ready. Good, she said. I've been fighting this land alone long enough. That night, long after she'd gone to her room, Abigail lay awake listening. She could hear the steady creak of their rocking chair in the main room. Nathaniel sitting watch, making sure the wind or the dark didn't bring trouble to her door. It had been 6 long months since she'd fallen asleep feeling safe. And that night she finally did. 3 weeks passed, and the Thornfield Ranch began to look alive again. The fences stood straight, the barn mended, and the herd grazed strong and healthy. Neighbors had started tipping their hats when they rode by, surprised to see smoke rising steady from Abigail's chimney again. Every morning started the same. Nathaniel working the stock, Abigail at her ledgers, and little Evangeline running between them, a blur of energy and dust. It was a rhythm none of them had planned, yet it fit as naturally as sunrise after night. But peace never lasted long on the frontier. It began one quiet morning when Abigail stepped outside to find 3 riders waiting at her gate. The man in front wore a fine coat and a sneer that didn't quite reach his eyes. Pike Morrison, she recognized. The hired gun for Cyrus Hartwell, the biggest land baron in the valley. Morning, Mrs. Thornfield, Morrison said, tipping his hat. Heard you've taken on help. Abigail folded her arms. That's right. You've got business here. Mr. Hartwell's concerned, Morrison said smoothly. Seems your cattle been wandering onto his land. 12 head, maybe more. That's a lie, she said flatly. We moved our herd days ago. Morrison's grin widened. So you're calling me Aliar? Nathaniel stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His tone was calm but cold. She's saying you're mistaken. Easy enough to prove, show us the cattle. Morrison's gaze slid over him. And you are just a hand, Nathaniel replied, who don't take kindly to threats. A long moment hung in there, hard as iron. Then Morrison leaned forward in his saddle. Careful, friend. This territory is full of accidents. Folks get lost. Barns catch fire. Be ashamed if something happened to this place or that little girl I saw peeking from the window. Abigail's breath caught. Nathaniel didn't move, but his eyes turned to steel. You ever threaten a child again, he said quietly, and you'll disappear into this land faster than smoke in the wind. The scarred man smirked. We'll see about that, he turned his horse. Tell your boss we'll be watching. When they rode away, Abigail's hands were shaking. He meant that, she whispered. I know, Nathaniel said. And I've met men like Hartwell before. They don't stop until someone makes them. That night, the ranch was quiet, but neither of them could sleep. Abigail sat by the fire, turning Samuel's old wedding ring between her fingers. Hartwell's been after this land for years, she said. He wanted our stream, the only one that doesn't freeze come winter. Nathaniel nodded slowly. Then he'll push harder now that he thinks you're alone. But I'm not, she said softly. He met Harry's across the fire. No, you're not. From that moment, unspoken understanding settled between them. The next few days were filled with tension. Nathaniel rode the fence lines, checking for tampering. Twice he found tracks, fresh horse prints, boot marks where men had watched the herd and moved on. Abigail kept Evangeline close, never letting her wander far from sight. Then one night the thing they feared happened. Nathaniel woke to the smell of smoke. Hay was on his feet before the thought even formed. Abigail. She burst from her room, Evangeline in her arms, eyes wide with terror. The barn. Flames roared against the sky, lighting the yard like day.
"Stay inside!"
Nathaniel shouted, already pulling on his boots, but Abigail didn't listen. She grabbed a bucket and ran for the pump. He met her halfway, the heat beating against their faces. "The horses," she yelled. Hep lunged into the burning barn, smoke clawing at his lungs. The horses screamed in panic, slamming against their stalls. He flung open each gate, shouting horse commands until the last of them bolted free when he stumbled out, coughing and covered in soot. Abigail was there throwing water where the fire licked nearest the house. Evangeline clung to her doll, sobbing softly, watching the only world she knew burn. By dawn, the barn was nothing but ash. They lost most of the tools, feed, and several head of cattle. Abigail stood staring at the smoking ruin, her face streaked with soot and tears. "It's gone," she whispered. "All of it." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He kicked to the ground, finding a half-burned torch stick. "They did this," he said. "And they wanted us to know it. And what now?" she asked. He looked at her, his voice like steel. "Now we fight back." By noon, riders began to arrive. Neighbors who'd seen the smoke from miles away. Tom Patterson, a sturdy rancher with gray in his beard, dismounted and gripped Nathaniel's hand. "Hartwell's men again." "Who else?" Nathaniel said. "Then we don't let it stand," Patterson said firmly. "If they'll burn one of us out, they'll burn us all. Time we stand together." Quote. Abigail blinked back tears as the others nodded in agreement. Men fetched hammers, saws, and lumber from their wagons. Women brought bread and coffee. By sunset, a small army of ranchers had filled the yard. The hammering started before first light the next morning, and by nightfall a new barn stood, stronger, taller, and better than the one before. When Abigail saw it finished, her voice broke. "I don't know how to thank you." Patterson smiled. "Don't thank us. Thank that fellow of yours. He's the one who rallied everyone." Abigail glanced at Nathaniel. He stood apart from the crowd, hat low, humility in every line of him. Yet the way he looked back at her told her the truth. He wasn't just protecting her ranch anymore. He was protecting something far deeper. That night, when the last of the neighbors rode off, she found him sitting on the porch steps, his rifle resting beside him. The stars glimmered bright above. "You think they'll stop?" she asked quietly. "No," he said. "Hartwell's too proud." "But no, he knows you're not alone." She hesitated. "I don't want you to get hurt, Nathaniel." He turned to her, eyes softening. "I've been running a long time, Abigail. From ghosts, from loss. But this place, this life, it feels like where I'm supposed to stop." Before she could reply, a small voice came from the doorway. Papa Evangeline stood there in her nightdress, clutching her doll. "Are the bad men coming back?" Nathaniel smiled gently. "Not tonight, sunshine." "Will you protect Mrs. Abigail too?" she asked. He looked at the widow, then back at his daughter. "With my life." Evangeline nodded, satisfied. "Good, 'cause she's our family now." Abigail's breath caught. Tears burned her eyes. Nathaniel reached over, resting a hand on the girl's head. "She's right," he said quietly. "We're family now." Abigail smiled through her tears. "Then we protect each other, whatever comes." They stood together as the wind swept across the dark prairie, carrying the scent of ash and new beginnings. Thieland was still harsh. The threat still real, but they had each other, and that was more powerful than fear. Nathaniel reached for her hand, rough palm against hers. "All things in their time," he murmured. She squeezed back. "And our time's just beginning." The ranch stood silent under the wide Montana sky. The widow, the drifter, and the child. 3 souls who'd found home where they least expected it. And in a land that took more than it ever gave. That was the rarest kind of miracle.